Great to be together and happy Lag BaOmer. And this essay of Rav Shai's stands out to me in having almost no parshanut, kind of going beyond the pshat, basically no recourse to rabbinic literature or really even quite close reading of text. It really puts a passage from our Parashah in conversation with a different passage from Hosea in an attempt to try to get at a core message of the Torah, and we'll be the judge of how convincing it is. But I think it's just interesting for trying to argue a very, very significant theological point that somehow is underlying so much of the covenant. What he adduces as proof, I think feels limited. I guess I'll just start off with that. So I'll share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, this essay is called God's Unfathomable Love, as we are on a double Parshah of Behar Bechukotai. And as I mentioned in this week's reminder email, we're going to shift to Nechama Leibowitz for Bamidbar. So that'll be our next modern commentary. Okay, God's Unfathomable Love. God finds the Jewish people exasperating. Again and again in the pages of Tanakh, God expresses frustration, disappointment, and anger over Israel's persistent waywardness. God dreams of living among a people who will be faithful, who will serve only God, who will love God with everything they have and everything they are, who will construct a society in which justice and decency prevail, and who will establish a community in which the widow, the orphan, and the stranger are protected, cared for, and even loved. Sounds great. But God's dreams are thwarted at every turn. Israel repeatedly descends into idolatry and allows the powerful to take advantage of the weak. Those who are part of our Thursday morning class, I think this is our experience of the books of the prophets that we've read so far, Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, the latter prophets, or the exhortative prophets, that the book is just filled with expressions of disappointment at the Jewish people's failure to live up to God's vision. Reading the prophets, one frequently wonders whether the covenant between God and Israel will finally come to an ignominious end. Yet it never does. Time and again, just when it seems that Israel's relationship with God has been irreparably breached, new hope emerges. The message of these texts is clear. Despite the depth of God's anguish, God will not abandon the people. To understand why is to learn something fundamental and potentially transformative about the God Jews worship. Leviticus 26, now we're starting to come to our Parashah, contains an extensive list of conditional blessings and curses. If in Hebrew, Israel obeys God, it will reap blessing and prosperity. And now he's going to sort of start to take us through some highlights of chapter 26, and we'll peek over there in a minute. So if Israel obeys God, it will reap blessing and prosperity, verses 3 to 13 of Leviticus 26. But if here the ve being a but as opposed to an and, but if it disobeys, it will face a cascade of calamities, verses 14 to 39. So here we can see Bechukotai starting in chapter 26, verse 3, with if you follow my laws faithfully, in Bechukotai telechu. And then we can see, just by skimming in the Hebrew or English, all the abundant agricultural blessings, peace, success over our enemies, fertility, God's presence in our midst. And that takes us through verse 13. And then ve'im lo tishma'uli, but if you do not obey me, then I will do this to you, starting on 16, and all kinds of terrible things, hostile beasts, wild beasts, hostility from God, a sword, eating and not being satisfied, more wrathful hostility. I mean, the nearly unthinkable, eating the flesh of your children, laying your cities in ruin, scattering you amongst the nations, stumbling as you flee, until verse 39. If the people refuse to change their ways, after one series of dreadful punishments, another even more horrific one will follow. Ultimately, unless Israel changes its ways, defeat and disease, natural disaster and wild beasts, invasion, famine, and pestilence will ravage both people and land. Desolation and devastation, followed by long exile, will ensue. Israel will be in danger of extinction. Whereas in the past, God took the people out of Egypt and made them walk upright. That's sort of the end and culmination of the blessing section in verse 13. I will lead you to walk upright. Now they will revert to their pre-Exodus state, unable to stand. Ein lachem tikuma. So you're just noticing for us those sort of bookends, essentially, by using the same root in opposite circumstances, going from being upright to not being able to stand before our enemies. But then, when all hope seems finally and definitively lost, a ray of light suddenly appears. Despite Israel's propensity for disobedience, and despite the repeated warnings that God will punish it severely, in ways that seem to erase every possible avenue for escape, God now announces that Israel's future remains open, not closed, to new possibilities. Those who survive will grow heartsick with remorse, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, in that they acted treacherously against me, and moreover were hostile to me. In the wake of exile in the land of their enemies, their uncircumcised heart shall humble itself, and they shall make restitution for their iniquity. The people, having turned back to God, God too will turn back to them. Then I will remember my covenant with Yaakov. I will also remember my covenant with Yitzchak, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. And again, here is just really narrating for us what happens seemingly suddenly at the end of this period of continued abandonment of God and not heeding the message of the punishments, and then continued and extensive punishments. Then suddenly, as he wants us to read it, those who remain will be heartsick over their sins and their sins of their ancestors, will confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their ancestors, and then God will see that their hearts humble themselves and they atone, and then God will remember God's covenant. Okay. Leviticus as a whole is profoundly concerned with the sacrificial system, which makes it all the more striking that here sacrifices are not mentioned at all. A humbled heart, genuine confession, and restitution for sin are enough. This is, a point I never really thought about, and I think is interesting, right? Why doesn't it say, and then you will heap sin offerings upon the altar and come with contrition to pour a litany of offerings of seeking forgiveness, something like that. On one level, of course, right, a humbled heart, genuine confession, and restitution for sin are enough. On one level, of course, sacrifice could not coherently be called for in these circumstances. The people are, after all, in exile. So he acknowledges there is potentially a simple shot answer to the question, which is, where would they even have offered offerings? They were in a place where they were exiled. They had no temple. That wasn't a viable option. Nevertheless, as Jacob Milgram points out, the importance of the concession should not be underestimated. The text's focus on confession rather than sacrifice approximates and perhaps influences the prophetic doctrine of repentance, which not only suspends the sacrificial requirement, but eliminates it entirely. The people do still need to pay their debt to God through the suffering they endure, But central to the passage is the power of divine mercy. Okay, so really just drawing our attention, again, even acknowledging, and that might be the beginning and end of the point, that sacrifices aren't here because where would they offer sacrifices? But at another level, we have this emphasis on the fact that the return to God is paved with things that are not cultic in any way, but are movements of the heart and movements of the spirit, a submission of their uncircumcised heart, and an atonement for their iniquity. As the passage continues, God affirms that despite their misdeeds, God will not repudiate the people or abandon God's covenant with them. Yet even then, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or loathe them so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. I will remember in their favor the covenant with the ancients, whom I freed from the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. I, the Lord. Right, those are the next couple psukim in the chapter. The Israelites rejected God's rules, but God will refuse to reject them. God loathes Israel's behavior, but God does not loathe Israel. So here again, he's just zeroing in on a couple of key verbs and highlighting the way in which they're used. Even though we act with rejection, God will not ultimately reject us. Yes, God is repulsed by our behavior, but not ultimately by us. The lesson here, Bible scholar Yochanan Mufs explains, is as powerful as it is simple. The rejection of Israel for defection, although demanded by logic, is precluded by the demands of divine love. Right? So just again, as he says, as powerful as it is simple, at some level, we have to acknowledge here that if left to the guidelines of strict justice, we would, and quid pro quo for our abandonment of the covenant, God should abandon us finally and ultimately, and God doesn't, and that seems to be because of God's love. In reading this passage, some scholars focused almost exclusively on God's startling mercy. Even though God has every reason to give up on Israel, God chooses not to do so. And yet, although God's love and mercy do lie at the heart of our passage, we should not overstate the point. God's commitment does indeed mean that God will not destroy the people, but the people are charged to mend their ways. They remain always responsible for their actions. The blend of divine grace and human responsibility is apparent. This is a both-and situation, precisely because it is viewed in relational terms. Both parties must respond and act. God's turn to Israel comes in tandem with, and arguably in response to, Israel's turn to God, right? So God's showing of love is the explanation for why God doesn't reject us altogether, but God's welcoming us back still depends on our movement towards God and our mending our ways. One more paragraph and then we'll pause. For all the centrality of love and mercy in our passage, Bible scholar Baruch Levine detects something else at play too. This is the Baruch Levine of the Vayidom Aharon essay about Aaron's silence or mourning. Recall God's words. I will remember in their favor the covenant with the ancients, whom I freed from the land of Egypt, in the sight of the nations, to be their God, I the Lord. Noting that the text mentions seemingly superfluously that God liberated the Israelites in the sight of the nations, Levine explains that the nations witnessed the covenant, so to speak. For this reason, to allow Israel to perish, though the punishment be deserved, would detract from God's renown. Hence, if Israel shows remorse and mends its ways, God will not cause the entire people to perish. If we accept Levine's interpretation, then it would seem that God's willingness to forgive Israel stems both from God's love and mercy on the one hand, and from God's self-interested concern with God's reputation on the other. Okay, so let me just pause here and sort of summarize that, what I think the case he's made thus far is to look at this, key section about what happens when we abandon the covenant, and goes through the long litany of ways in which we'll be punished, but then still comes back and says, but look, we should, by all just measures, ultimately just be let go of. And God doesn't do that. And that's, for three reasons. Underlying it all is his argument, is God's love. And that's, read by these verbs where it says we reject God, but God won't reject us and things like that. And the fact that, we break our side and God punishes us, but doesn't ultimately abandon us. That's because of this underlying bedrock of love. Second, because we show a change in our behavior. And third, because of this dimension of God's self-interest, God's reputation in the world. So, when he says for all the centrality of love and mercy in our passage, it's just hard to absorb to me because just of the proportionality of it, meaning even if you accept the argument that it's love that keeps God from fully abandoning the covenant, I just still find it like a hard case to accept that the thrust of this message is love. So that's why he's in a few moments going to try to build this up from a different location, which he sees as a more central text about God's love. But I want to collect any thoughts or reactions thus far. So Scott, go ahead.
I'm with you on this. I find this very, I don't know, inconsistent with the text. The text, to me, is so awful, is so terrible. And the punishments that are enumerated are so abhorrent that the idea that somehow this text can be turned around to make it look like God loves the people is, to me, very far-fetched.
Yeah. So it's fascinating to me. And again, we're not done the essay, but reading this section, on its own as he is, I think is challenging. And yeah, I don't know. It's certainly, I want to give Rav Shai the benefit of the doubt and say, I'm going along for the journey. And look, it's so, there's such a longing for, I feel a longing for demonstrations of God's love. And it relates to what, the question I was asking last week from our prophets class about, where are those affirmative expressions in real time? And so it's so striking to me that he is aiming to make the case from this section. So I agree with you as I hear you agreeing with me.
He may not have finished the essay, but the text is, to me, the text is pretty clear.
Yeah. Other thoughts, reactions to what we've seen so far here? Natty James?
It would seem almost more loving not to torture the Jewish people than just exile them or kill them or wipe them out somehow. Instead of this chapter and verse of the most horrid punishments and torture, families could even imagine.
Yeah. Like, right. God is sort of saying, like, and if you persist, then I'll do this to you. And if you persist, then I'll do this to you. And I almost feel, it feels like Rav Shai is trying to read it as because I'm still waiting for you to do the right thing because I really want this relationship, but it's just it's again, I don't know what to say. It's just so extraordinary to me that we're trying to draw this message out from here, but maybe that's because of all passages, this is such a hard one to, accept. But it's just a far reach to really read it as not a base, not the basis of, or a proof of, for God's love, but almost seems like what he's trying to do here. So it's challenging. It's very challenging. Let's go on. The God of Hosea, too, is infuriated by Israel's incessant unfaithfulness, yet is willing, time and again, against all odds, to reconcile with God's recalcitrant people. In contrast to Leviticus, in Hosea's case, what keeps God faithful to Israel is unambiguous. God loves Israel and simply cannot abandon them. In one of the most beautiful chapters in Tanakh, Hosea presents God as a parent, filled with love for his or her children. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The verse conveys the heart of Hosea's teaching, that God's relationship with Israel has always been animated first and foremost by love. But it subtly adds two crucial dimensions to that teaching. First, Hosea teaches that God loves Israel before God asks or demands anything of them. Second, Hosea does not attribute God's love to this attribute or that. God's love for Israel is a function of divine grace rather than human merit. In other words, Israel does not earn God's love. It simply receives it as a gift from God. And now, sort of like he did with the Leviticus chapter, he's going to take us a little bit through the Hosea chapter, Hosea 11. Hosea poignantly evokes the tender care God took of God's beloved child. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk and took them into my arms. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. Yet, despite God's nurturing love, the people turn away, seduced by Baal and the worship of idols. One senses that God wants to walk away, but so deep is God's love that God cannot tolerate complete rupture with God's child. The immense pathos of the chapter lies in part in the audacious insistence that God will not give up on God's people, because given the intensity of God's love, God simply cannot do so. The prophet daringly portrays God's internal struggles. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah, render you like Tzivoyim? Admah and Tzivoyim were destroyed with the neighboring cities Sodom and Gomorrah. The implicit answer to this fourfold chain of rhetorical questions, how can I, is that God cannot. Israel's betrayal and disloyalty notwithstanding, God's love always has the final word. I have had a change of heart. My compassion grows warm. I will not act on my wrath, will not turn to destroy Ephraim. Just look at this a little bit inside from Hosea 11. Right, I fell in love with Israel when he was still a child, called him my son ever since Egypt. But they went their own way to sacrifice to Baalim. Now God comes back again. I pampered Ephraim, but they ignored my healing care. I drew them with these human ties, cords of love, as though I was offering them food, but no, they returned to the land of Egypt. They refused to repent, and therefore, these punishments are going to come. God turns around again. How can I give you up? How can I surrender you? I had a change of heart. My tenderness is stirred. I will not act on my wrath, will not turn to destroy Ephraim. Now we're going to come to this next section, for I am God, not man. What stops God from acting on God's anger? For I am God, not man, the Holy One in your midst. As any reader of Hosea can attest, anthropomorphism is Hosea's stock in trade. Yet Hosea wants to be clear that metaphors for God are precisely that, metaphors and not essential definitions. God is like a human parent, but God is not, in fact, a human parent. God's declaration that I am God, not man, is one of the most arresting images in Tanakh. What makes God God and not a mere human being? The fact that, unlike a human parent, God cannot ever truly give up on God's child. Mere mortals might not be so generous. Their response to betrayal and deep hurt may be more vindictive, more punitive, with the dissolution of whatever vestige of the damaged relationship still remained. Even good parents sometimes give up on their children. But despite all that has happened, Hosea insists, God remains the Holy One in your midst. In other words, the greatness of God consists in the unfathomable depths of divine love and forgiveness. This is how God explains God's own godness. God defines God's otherness, God's divine uniqueness, not in terms of power, wisdom, or sovereignty, but in terms of love. Constant, sure, steadfast, right? So sort of he's really, delving and driving deeply into this, this phrase, El Anochi Velo Ish, and sort of asking the question, okay, you could explain God being God and not a man in so many different ways, and the choice to describe God as God and not man, because God, won't ultimately punish God's people, won't ultimately give up on them in a way which, at some level, a human being pushed to the brink will sever a relationship. But the definition of what separates God from man and what makes God God is the maintaining of that relationship, even against, all of the rejection that God might be experiencing from us. In Numbers, the prophet Bilam announces that God is not a man, but God's uniqueness lies in the fact that God is not capricious. Lo ish el v'yachazev, right? God is not a man is God to be false, or translated here as capricious. Chazav is sort of something in the realm of falsehood or mercuriality or something like that. In other words, God's godness is evidenced by the fact that God will not change God's mind, right? That's for Bilam, the ultimate, in the rabbi's eyes, the ultimate non-Jewish prophet, and actually, interestingly, whom Nathan Lindenbaum referenced last time as the example of the vehicle through which God does express positive, feelings towards Bnei Israel in real time, although we're only aware of it when we read it in the Torah. But even there, when Bilam talks about what makes God God and not a human, it's God's kind of unchanging nature. Hosea offers a radical and indeed breathtaking alternative. God's godness is evidenced by the fact that God's love is so deep that God will in fact change God's mind and pull back from the judgment God had planned to execute. I think this is a really lovely, reading of the seeming contradiction almost between these two texts. We have two texts that talk about that God is God and not a human, and one makes that about God's unchangingness, and the other in Hosea, is that God says, Nepach alai libi, I've had a change of heart. I won't destroy because I am God and not a human. And that definition is that I'm willing to change my mind and not destroy. What is adumbrated in Leviticus is fully fleshed out in Hosea. Okay, so right now, this now is where he's going to, hitch these two texts to one another and attempt through Hosea to redeem for us a little bit more our passage and our Parashah and Vayikra. What is adumbrated in Leviticus is fully fleshed out in Hosea. God's greatness consists ultimately not in God's inscrutability or in God's power, but rather in God's love and mercy. Hosea's point is that God's love is vast beyond measure. It behooves us to ask, and it's interesting, as we've read Rav Shai's essays, usually he has a longer passage about what does this mean for us in our world today. This one is so kind of overtly theological, although that's not even really the different from some of the others. But so I'll just maybe make it as a observation. It's interesting that in this one he has just this kind of thought-opening sentence rather than a further really explication. Hosea's point is that God's love is vast beyond measure. It behooves us to ask, what kind of communities and what kind of world would we build if we truly took that to heart? Right? It's just interesting. I feel like another version of this would go towards, so how do we, and this is what I think he's hinting at, how do we emulate God in trying to have love supersede the instinct to abandon in a relationship, or to kind of jettison it. Although I'm not even totally sure whether he's inviting us to think about how we would model our behavior on God. If God is not a man, but is God, and that indication is, God's willingness to change God's mind out of love in order to preserve the relationship. Is he pointing us towards sort of saying, how can we be more like that? Or in some sense, is he just saying, how would we behave differently in the world if we really internalized that love is, in God's covenantal relationship with us is there? I'm not sure I know the answer to that question of what direction is he wanting us to go in with his closing question. But I really put it here to reflect on with you and to acknowledge that, and I think we've talked about this in a different setting also, that I do think that, there are many texts, rabbinic and otherwise, liturgical and otherwise, that talk about God's love for the Jewish people, and just find it, and I think the Hosea one is quite beautiful and stronger than the Leviticus one that we're looking at. And I think it's just really interesting to try to position this here, and look at it in light of this week's Parsha, and ask the question, what does it mean for us? Do we find it, I guess to say one more thing in first person, I sort of feel that sense of a loving God, covenantally loving God, is one that I kind of read almost in, and lift up almost in spite of most of the biblical text, and not kind of based on it. So it's I think an important and challenging conversation, and this is sort of a trigger for that. So happy to hear any further thoughts and reactions. Back to you, Tati James.
What does the Bible mean when it refers to love? It doesn't have any great examples of romantic love or even platonic love, really. I mean, it doesn't have examples of affection, I should say. So I guess, what does Rav Held think of when or Hosea, when he's talking about God's love and it being in the Torah?
Yeah. I mean, we've got Yaakov and Rachel. What do we know about? What do we actually know about that from their relationship? It's hard. Yeah, exactly. We have we have the places where the verb ahav is used in narrative, but we don't have too much really spelling out of what that looks like. So I think it's a very good question. I mean, one pasuk from the Navi comes to mind, although translating it is not so easy. And I don't have the exact words at my fingertips, but I think it's from Yirmiyahu, which is the Ahavat Olam Ahavtich Al Kain Meshachtich Chesed, right? I loved you with an eternal love, and therefore I have drawn you to me in loving kindness. So there's something, which is about special kind behavior, but obviously, right, we when we think about love, we think about romantic love. So what is covenantal love? I think it's a great question. I mean, I guess what we can take away from this essay is the way minimally he's understanding it is, love is a feeling or connection which causes one to put aside what might be fair or even instinctive in a relationship where the other party is seeming to abandon or reject. And it's the decision to, alongside the punishing, stay with it and keep waiting for the return, and then reconnect in the wake of that return. So I don't know, it feels like largely maybe like a patience and an unwillingness to give up on the relationship. It's sort of more framed from the negative than the positive in these passages, right? It's I'm not going to give up on you. That's I guess my first thought.
Even as I'm torturing you.
Yeah. I mean, look, we have to come around from the other side here still and say, and cautious for sure, very cautiously, if we take the text at its face value, so we totally rejected God, we worshipped other gods, we abandoned God. Again, why should that lead to all these horrific things happening to us? But
I guess that's what's underlying my question is, are these punishments examples of God withdrawing his love? Like, is God actively providing these punishments for us, or is this just living on earth without God's protection?
Right. I think that's a great question. I whatever my theological preference is the latter, and I think Rav Meidan's comments would often drive us to try to see it in the latter, but it's still challenging that the way the shot of the chapter feels like it reads is really the former. So I'm going to do this to you, as opposed to, oh, we have other places where it is, I'll hide my face from you. But here it feels more like I will mete out vengeful punishment upon you. Right. I like there's another version of this, where it could be we abandon the covenant. And so God says, I'm going to go off in a corner and cry and weep and mourn until you miss me and come back. Right. That could also be
blessings, and I will abandon the covenant, and you will be left wandering without a temple or without a homeland. Is all seems like withdrawing that love, whatever that means. It just seems to go so much further in that I'm going to force you to come back to me because I love you so much.
Right. David L.
To pick up on what James was saying, the text is very clear that God is doing this to us. Aphania says, verse 16. It's not that this is the horrific world, it's that this is God meeting out, God doing stuff. I want to pick up another thing James said. I didn't see the word love anywhere in this chapter. And I think maybe it's the case that, people who are in love see love everywhere, and Shai is a very loving person. And for people who work in the world of contracts, this reads to me much more like a contract. And here are the terms of the contract. And if you obey the contract, this is what's going to happen. If you don't obey the contract, that's what's going to happen. And the last part is what we call a cure provision. Even if you violate the contract, there's a way to come back into a state of grace.
Yeah. So that I appreciate your kind of the challenge, the reading, the contextualizing of Rav Shai's approach, and then the different frame. And I guess what does that do for you? Meaning, is there therefore kind of, there's just these different frameworks of thinking about our relationship with God. We have the loving one, we have the contractual one, and they do different things for us in different times. You're going to say, and I don't know any more about that, kind of the benefits of reading this in a different frame?
Well, I think what Rav Shai is saying is read this together with Hosea. It's like if you're going to go out for a really spicy meal, you might want to bring along some Pepto-Bismol. Hosea is the Pepto-Bismol for this chapter. But whether it's a convincing read of this chapter standing on its own, I think Rev Scott made the point to start. I think it stands as a strong critique.
Great. Thank you. Nice added thoughts. Yep, back to you, Scott.
I just want to say that, that this, it seems to me, is a fair interpretation, perhaps, of the Hosea passages, but there, if the passages in Bechukotai represent God's attitude, it's not a God I would want to have a relationship with. It's not a God whose love I'm looking for. I mean, to me, reading it makes me think of a parent who's beating a child until, the child is almost unconscious, and then the parent being sorry and, say, oh, I love you. I mean, it's one thing to punish someone as a lesson, but these punishments are very extreme if we're looking at it from the perspective of being a lesson for the people.
Yeah. Good wrestling up. I'm looking forward. I have this I have a sample copy of this new Leiv Lada'at Chumash that Koren is putting out. It's described as for teens and young adults. I think they in some ways sell themselves short, or maybe have a different worldview of how we engage with Chumash. I think that the format lends itself to people of all ages who are looking for meaningful reflection and digesting the Chumash and applying it to our everyday. So it has lots of little thought questions and reflections on the challenging questions that the text opens up. So I didn't get a chance to look at it before, but I'll see what it has to say on kind of this Tochacha section. If there's anything to add, I'll send it your way. And yep, just appreciating James's comment also, right? Even in the framework of a contract, I'm not sure the risk reward seems worth it. Yeah. So, I mean, then of course, we're left with the question of sort of, okay, so how do we engage this today? Do we make the move of this was a theological framework that made more sense back then, or did a different thing for the people of that time? Always we recognize that if you take this at face value, it somehow gives us a feeling of more empowerment or choice. That right, we really can control our fate and make the choice to do good and be rewarded. And just we live in a world that feels much different from that in so many ways. So, if we reading it as we are reading it in this way of sort of, I don't want this covenant, I don't want this version of contract. What do we do then with that as a biblical text? Do we say, okay, somehow that I put that in the context of its time and believe that there is a different framework now? Obviously, we have rabbinic basis for some of those kinds of shifts, but I think in feeling challenged by this, it feels like if we don't accept Rav Shai's reading, or I'm still glad, of course, that we're engaging the challenge of the text itself. Scott, and then back to David.
Is there any basis for seeing this text as something that's meant to explain something that has happened? In other words, these terrible things that we read about in this and also in Kitavo, is it possible that it's somebody trying to grapple with these awful occurrences, and the only thing to do with it is to say, it's a punishment from God?
Right. Yeah, it certainly, I mean, it certainly seems possible.
I mean,
No.
I'm not saying it's desirable.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm just wondering if that's a way of looking at it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think from a, how we approach the biblical text, if we take it all as sort of being given in real time, then it's a more challenging read. And if we somehow look at it as, something more accumulated over time and presented to us, it having been compiled or written later, then that interpretation feels like it's more possible just on a first reaction to that. Yeah. David L.
Only because you invited it. Maybe it's easy to read it with the Yitz Greenberg gloss on Shiloh. And to say that the story of the Chumash, if not the whole Tanakh, is a story of the failure or the impossibility of God to dwell in the midst of the people. And that fits nicely with Rav Yitz's idea that the balance of power shifts with the maturation of mankind, the development of technology, and all sorts of things. So while being a junior partner or a child in a relationship, man moves into more maturity, more responsibility on man's shoulders. Not to say man's going to get away with that either, but maybe the story of Chumash is just the story that, and the Tanakh really, that God can't dwell in the midst of the people. It doesn't work. The demands of that level of holiness just don't work out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Even if disappointing at one level, maybe it's, relieving almost at another level. Yeah. Great. James, back to you. Last thought.
Yeah, just I'm thinking as we open up our communities to more and more people who are not observant for whatever reason, or are unable to observe all of the commandments for whatever reason, how do we, how does this seem fair? I mean, how does this seem like something we read aloud?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to add that to the questions are better than the answers theme for today. Yeah, good to continue to wrestle with. Again, hopefully this is obviously exceedingly heavy stuff, but it feels worthwhile and important to kind of just read, confront, think about, even if we don't have answers to, for an honest engagement with the Torah. Obviously, there's we've got Shemitah and Yovel and lots of other beautiful things in this week's Parashah, but I wanted to bring this for our just consideration and reflection. I appreciate the wisdom of the group and honesty of the group as we sort of just navigate it and sit with it. So,
are you keeping the list of questions for the author?
No. I'm just letting him off the hook every time.
Mita and Yovel are great examples of God's love.
Yes. All right. Well, this question takes the cake. So if we just ask Rav Shai this one, maybe Dayenu, but we'll see. All right. Thanks to everybody. And again, this is it for Rav Shai for this round, and we'll have Nechama Leibowitz for Bamidbar. So looking forward to a fresh perspective coming up. Thanks to all. Love to mom and dad. Happy Lag BaOmer. Good night to all. Bye.